Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to get our dance moves on. We're going to talk about music that has been imported from Cuba. As always, I've prepared some lecture notes for today. It's important that we get, as always, an idea of our historical survey right off the bat. So I'm going to mostly talk about this upper left-hand side here first. Then we're going to, in parts, for part one and parts 2, 3, and 4, dissect the other, sorry, I don't know if this is sharing anymore, dissect the other genres that are surrounding those areas, talking a lot about dance music, and specifically dance music of the mid-century that was very, very, very popular and imported from Cuba. Cuba is, of course, very close to the United States, particularly Florida. So we're going to, and the southern part of the country in general. So we're going to talk a lot about musical imports as they relate to Florida specifically, although we can hear a lot of influence from Cuban music really heard throughout the states. There's a strong standing Latin Cuban jazz fusion that emerges, in 1950 in New York City, but we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the East Coast, really directing our attention to Florida. So why are we going to talk about Cuban music in general? Well, Cuban music is going to be relevant to the United States because, as always, we're tracking and tracing the migration patterns of individuals, and especially mid 1900s, right? We're going to, and shortly after, 1960, 70, with the Cold War and the arms race with the USSR and Cuba taking a side with the USSR and ultimately facing off with the US is going to have major impacts on the social fabric and, of course, music, because music and culture always seem to have a very close-knit relationship. On the left-hand side here, we start relatively dully, I suppose. 1492, Columbus, right? He ends up making 4 trips to the New World, as we well know, and ends up landing on the island of Cuba during his first visit. The first city of Cuba isn't founded until 1512, and during this point, we mostly have a somewhat peaceful existence until we have the major intrusion of an imperialist power, and that's in 1762, and that's when the British end up occupying Cuba. And from 1762 and on, we seem to have a more tumultuous history. Not that before 1762 wasn't wrought with issues, but by 1868, we have a rising upper middle class, a creative artist class that emerges, and a call for independence that is finally spoken up for, and after which we have one of the first of many occupations by the United States, and that's right before the turn of the century. The first occupation of Cuba lasted 3 years and was fairly helpful for Cuba in general. The U.S. helped, establish and create a school system, a judicial system, and helped draft a constitution. Unfortunately, there was a lot of political corruption in the government of Cuba, and while there were some strides forward, there were some major steps backwards as well. The second occupation of Cuba happened not really all that long afterwards, 1906 to 1909. And what really was a bummer is that this act of the U.S. coming in for a second time really disabled the Cubans from having an autonomous government of their own. And instead of being able to sort of stand on their own 2 feet, became reliant on the U.S. And that did not end up going over well, because there were obviously corruptions within the government, you know, fingers pointed as to who is the corrupting force. I'm not here to be like, you know, one side was good and one side was evil. We have a number of interesting factors that are creating a tumultuous environment at this time. But there was certainly a great, huge party against, you know, the U.S. occupation that was happening, especially the second time. And there was an overthrow of the regime that was established in 1933. And from that point on, we see a very strong rise of militarism that's going to be a marked characteristic of the future of Cuba. I have this box around 1959 because it's a major turning point in terms of, I guess, more recent US historical events, and that is the Castro dictatorship, and the absolutely botched operation and military failure that was the Bay of Pigs. The US arranged for 1,200 to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro, but it was an absolute, an epic disaster. And not as a result, but certainly did not dissuade Cuba from being an ally to the USSR in 1962. And of course, this is going to be a big issue because, you know, the US and the USSR are at odds with each other in the great conflict known as the Cold War. The Cold War, what an interesting time. To just give you an idea as to the kind of public paranoia, not public, paranoia is really a strong word, that there was a lot of sensationalism happening in the media, not unlike today. But you can see this worry, this blanket of dread over all kind of creative projects that are happening even within the realm of cinema at this time. If you haven't seen any of the old or classic episodes of The Twilight Zone, for example, pull up some things that were happening in the 1960s. They really paint a picture through the use of obvious metaphor, narrative metaphor, that there is an arms race going on, and there is a worry about communism, and communism being and dictatorship, and that sense of political socialism being being something that threatens US democracy. And that's going to be a big to-do. I have a number of historical videos to show us. What I think is interesting, though, to note about Cuba in general is that while there's a huge sense of music that is, while we have an environment that is imbued with social and political unrest, we have an interesting musical export that is occurring simultaneously alongside of this socialist movement with Castro. And Unlike some of the other traditions that we've listened to and looked at, like soca and calypso being a vehicle of um, uh, expressing disdain for what's happening in government in terms of corruption, um, we don't see and hear that as much in Cuban music. And instead, we're going to, the thing that is going to really catch on and make a lasting impression is, and transcend time, because we're going to start our story in terms of music a little bit earlier and talk about the roots of these dance tunes. But like, we ultimately, that's what we're headed towards, is dance music rather than music for protest. As a result, I just want us to like kind of flag that as an idea. Why is it that somewhere that has a lot of social and political activism, why isn't that occurring as the main musical export? I don't want to answer that question right away. I just want us to kind of chew on it a little bit. Again, also consider maybe that trend and how that has been replicated in music of South Korea, for example, where K-pop, for example, is really, really, really into the dance element, and is not about lyrics expressing disdain or the motivation for some sort of social movement. In any case, I want to play us a little bit of a historical survey video that drops us in around the time that the dance craze was really hot and heavy, and that is mid-century, and give us a view as to how the United States is interacting with Cuba and what is going to spur the major waves of immigration that are going of Cuban Americans that are going to hit Florida very specifically. All right, so this drops us into the last 100 years of Cuban history. I'm going to, after that, go backwards a little bit and talk about the basis of the music and dance tradition in slave cultures in Cuba, but this is going to relate a little bit more directly to the dance craze, which was very prevalent in the US in the 1950s and 60s. But we're going to start our story in 1902.
The U.S. ended the occupation, and Cuba launched into nationhood with fewer problems than most Latin American nations. Prosperity increased during the early years. Militarism seemed curtailed. Social tensions were not profound. Yet corruption, violence, and political irresponsibility grew. A second United States intervention and economic involvement weakened the growth of Cuban nationality and made Cuba more dependent on its northern neighbor. The 1930s saw a major attempt at revolution. Prompted by a cruel dictatorship, the economic hardships of the World Depression, the growing control of the economy by Spaniards and North Americans, and a series of international events that included the Soviet and Mexican revolutions and student revolts in Latin America. A group of Cubans led by students and intellectuals and supported by the military sought radical reforms and a profound transformation of Cuban society. The overthrow of the regime of Gerardo Machado in 1933 catapulted Ramon Grau San Martin, a University of Havana physiology professor, and a group of students into power. Grau issued a series of progressive measures that broke with Cuba's past, yet the short-lived revolution of 1933 failed. The rise of militarism, the opposition of the United States, and divisions among Cuban political elites and within the revolutionary ranks returned the island to less turbulent talk. Fulgencio Batista, an obscure army sergeant, emerged as the leader of the military after overthrowing the U.S.-trained officers. The military became the arbiter of Cuban politics, first through de facto ruling, and finally with the election of Batista to the presidency in 1940. Batista collaborated with Grau in drafting the liberal constitution of 1940, now without the Platt Amendment. The end of World War II and the end of this early Batista era brought to power the inheritors of the 1933 revolution. In the democratic election of 1944, Grau San Martin became president, and 4 years later, his ally, Carlos Prío Socarrás, was elected. An era of democratic governments, respect for human rights, and accelerated prosperity ensued. Some expected a continuation of the revolutionary measures of 1933. Political violence and corruption increased. Many saw these administrations, commonly known as auténticos, as having failed to live up to the ideals of the revolution. Some still supported the auténticos and hoped for new leadership that could correct the vices of the past. Others turned to a new group, the ortodoxos, led by the charismatic leader Eduardo Chivas, a popular elected senator. But Chivas committed suicide in 1951. A few conspired to take power by force. Batista staged the coup d'etat on March 10, 1952, and returned to power. This event had a profound effect. It led to doubts about the ability of Cubans to govern themselves. It began a brutal dictatorship that resulted in the polarization of Cuban society, civil war, the overthrow of the Batista dictatorship, the destruction of the military, and most other Cuban institutions, and the rise of Fidel Castro's long totalitarian rule. But despite the political crisis, Cuba's economic growth was remarkable. In Latin America, Cuba ranked fourth in meat consumption, fifth in milk, and third in per capita food calories per day. In 1958, Cuba had over 1 million radios for a ratio of 1 set per every 6 persons, ranking 8th in the world ahead of France and Great Britain. Television came to Cuba in October of 1950, placing the island among the first countries in the world to enjoy this entertainment marvel. In 1958, Cuba had 23 TV stations and more than 400,000 TV sets for a per capita of 1 TV set for every 15 people. Cuba also enjoyed a cultural renaissance, producing world-renowned musicians like Ernesto Lecuona and Julián Orbón, and painters like Wilfredo Lam and René Portocarrero. Out with the old and in with the new, remarked Ernest Hemingway. January 1st, 1959. The toppling of Batista signaled the dawn of a new era. Power lay in the streets, and Fidel Castro and his rebels came down from the mountains to claim it. A magistrate named Manuel Urrutia was sworn in as the new Cuban president. The cabinet was pluralistic, comprised of figures of diverse political spectrum. The charismatic leader of the 26th of July movement, Fidel Castro, was appointed commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Castro quickly emerged as the most prominent political figure. On January 8th, a triumphant Fidel addressed a large gathering in the capital city of Havana. He concluded his speech by declaring that he had no political ambitions and promising elections. April 15th, 1959. Fidel Castro arrived in the United States. Before leaving Cuba, Castro told reporters that the trip would serve to strengthen the ties with the United States. I know, first of all, that people are saying that we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear. Castro hid his anti-Americanism and his plan to transform Cuban society into a totalitarian state. He defended what he called revolutionary justice. Time magazine reminded its readers that by the end of April 1959, 529 Cubans had been executed. communist presence grew within the revolutionary ranks. By Christmas 1959, the country's moderate cabinet leaders had been forced out. President Urrutia was removed and replaced by a loyal communist. Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine Marxist that joined Castro in the mountains, became president of the National Bank. Fidel's brother Raúl began organizing a repressive security apparatus modeled on the East German Stasi and the Soviet KGB. As the revolution entered its second year, the old economic order was overturned by the confiscations of foreign as well as Cuban-owned businesses. In a very short time, Cuba became a Marxist society under the control of an all-powerful leader. The media, the education system, all of Cuba's institutions fell into the hands of Castro's government. On May 1st, 1960, a large crowd gathered at La Plaza de la Revolución for May Day festivities. Fidel Castro adamantly rejected the need for elections, affirming that the voice of the people had elected him and the revolutionary leaders. U.S.-Cuban relations deteriorated. Diplomatic relations were broken, and the Kennedy administration imposed an embargo on Cuba. The eventual shutdown of the press allowed Castro to launch an assault against his opposition, which produced an increase of political prisoners and massive migrations out of the island. In late 1960 and 1961, the U.S. organized and trained 1,200 Cubans for an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. The promised vital air cover from the United States over the Bay of Pigs never arrived. The 1,200 Cubans were left stranded. It was a tragic disaster. After the failed invasion, Castro proclaimed,
"Porque hay que decir que por encima de todo somos marxistas-leninistas."
"What we can say above all is that we are Marxist-Leninists." He embarked on a program to create a new man along socialist ideas, emphasizing loyalty to the party and the leader, and anti-Americanism. Fearing Marxist indoctrination, many Cuban parents sought a way out for their children. Operation Pedro Pan, as in Peter Pan, sent thousands of unaccompanied children to the United States in the care of the Catholic Church.
And that's where we'll pause this for right now. So what we've been studying is a lot of migration patterns of particular ethnic groups or religious groups or groups of any sort. In this case, in 1960, because of the rise of Fidel Castro, because of the political unrest of Cuba, we're going to have, from this point forward, three major waves of Cuban immigration, very specifically to Florida. Florida becomes such a hub, obviously because of its proximity, hopefully, to Cuba, as you probably know. It's going to be the first stopping point and initial destination of a lot of refugees. And as a result, there's a number of them that don't go any further than Florida. Florida becomes such a popular destination that Little Havana is established in Miami as a meeting point and area of great concentration of new Cuban immigrants, as a way of, establishing the feel of Cuba in a small slice of Miami. We see this in New York, we have Little Italy. I don't know if it's, having gone to Italy, it's only so much like Italy, but it's, or just like we have Chinatown, for example. They had, the Cubans had a meeting place that they created and carved out on their own. And the last initiative that was mentioned, the Peter Pan initiative, was really about moving children, unaccompanied minors, that to some extent ended up being reunited or not so reunited with their parents, thinking that the political unrest was not going to be a long-winded endeavor, and yet decades went by before Fidel Castro eventually, died. So as the film also mentioned, there was a major renaissance that happened, in Cuba before all of this political unrest that starts to be the foundation of a number of the dance traditions that we see becoming very popular in the mid-century. One question we should ask is, like, why is Cuba of interest to everyone? Why does this continuing roller coaster of good times, bad times afflict Cuba in the from 1900 to, and beyond? And part of that obviously is within the history. What makes Cuba particularly important, just like any other area for an imperialist power, was the ability to draw resources from that area. And what was Cuba going to be known for? Sugar and agriculture. Having a very warm climate and the necessary grounds for sugar in particular, which is going to be very desirable for a number of imperialist powers. And so what happens, very in the briefest sort of sense, is that Cuba, sort of before the 1900s and into it, becomes a playground of wealth for particular groups of European and American imports, and then a whole economy that is driven by sugar. And where you have a labor-intensive crop, you require labor for it. So what is the early part of Cuban history that predates 1900? It is slavery. Slavery is huge. And there is a lot of civil unrest due to slavery pre-1900. So the thing that afflicts Cuba pre-1900s is slavery and civil unrest, attempting to have freedom, not really quite getting there because there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And then that same kind of trend happening in the 1900s, but instead of slavery, we have communism and socialism being on the front page, so to speak, of that newspaper. So as a result, what is the music that's going to be majorly influential in setting the stage for our dance tunes that come about in the 1900s? And that is music that is imported from Africa. So we're going to recall some Afrocentric musical traditions that incorporate huge elements of dance into ritual. So those are our connecting ideas and our connecting tissues. So that's a little bit about Cuban history, specifically how Cuban history relates to US history, and when the major migration started occurring from Cuba to America, and that is 1960 is really our start date and era there. So when we come back for part 2, because this part has run a little bit long, I'm going to drop us into our discussion of why dance music, what about music, traditional music imported from Africa, from slaves, is going to mix with the folk music tradition that's happening in Cuba to create this interesting fusion and basis for major dance genres that are going to offspring from our initial big genre we call son. So, but we'll get to that in parts 2 and 3. All right, I'll see you for part 2 shortly.